everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second webinar of our summer series, I Teach, where we are talking about education, assessment, and current happenings in today's education market. My name is Allison Boyven, and I am on the marketing team here at Riverside Insights, and I will be your host for today's webinar alongside another former educator, Rita Linneman, who is the product manager for several of our achievement assessments. In the first webinar of this series, we learned about comparisons with student performance in math from pre-COVID to now in the post-COVID era, and the domains in which students are doing well and not as well at the national and state levels, particularly at the elementary level. And we also learned about how to dig into data within particular assessment reports, all the way down to the item level to support you at the district and school levels with identifying areas of strength and learning opportunities. Well, today we are excited to welcome back Dr. Kathy Welch and Dr. Steve Dunbar, who will help us understand all of those assessment scores that you see on assessment reports, including an SS, a GE, NPR, NS, RS, and NCE. And some of you may be thinking, what do all those letters stand for? And what is the value of each of them on a report? And how do we explain those scores to students and parents? And what are the differences among them? But before we get started, we do want to share a few announcements, and then we will introduce our speakers. Throughout the summer, we are presenting webinars on various education topics, including building a positive testing culture, PLCs and data meetings, and how assessment data drives instruction. So be sure to join us each week as educators share their thoughts and perspectives on the given topic. Look for our weekly webinar invites. During today's session, you may have questions that you would like our speakers to answer. We absolutely welcome those questions. So please type them in the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. It's going to look something like this. You'll see questions or chat box. So put those there, and we'll be sure to share your questions as the topic arises during today's discussion. There are also a few handouts included with today's session. Those are located under the handouts triangle in the right side panel. So be sure to download those during today's webinar. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive the recording, a copy of the slides, the handouts, and a certificate of attendance in the next day or two. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox as well. Also, recordings of our previous webinars can be found on our website at info.riversideinsights.com/K12PD. Opening this page provides you with this header shown here, and last week's webinar is included on that page as well. And now on to today's presentation and discussion. So we are excited to welcome back today our two authors of the Iowa assessments, Dr. Kathy Welch and Dr. Steve Dunbar, as our speakers. So I'm going to pass it over to them just to introduce themselves before we get going.
Thanks, Allison. Happy to be here. I'm Kathy Welch, University of Iowa. I've spent my life worrying about assessment and hopefully making assessment of value to educators.
And I'm Steve Dunbar, also at the University of Iowa. Kathy and I are directors of a unit called the Iowa Testing Programs. We do research and development work as well as teach graduate courses in educational measurement to prospective educators as well as professionals in the field.
We are glad to have you both here with us again. So we are looking forward to hearing about your research with assessment scores and learning how to best use scores on standardized reports to affect classroom instruction. We do have both district and building administrators as well as teachers joining us today on this webinar, and helping them understand how to read these scores and knowing next steps is valuable with moving student learning forward. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to both of you to get started and share your insights about these norm reference scores.
Thanks very much, Allison. Appreciate that. So the next slide really gives us sort of what we hope to be sure we cover today. Looking at metrics, as Allison said, what are the different metrics? What do they bring to the conversation? And then how can I bring particular metrics to growth, to the measurement of growth, to the interpretation of growth? So we've divided the next few minutes into 4 different topics, the metrics themselves, and then thinking about the measurement of growth using standard scores versus the measurement of growth using national percentile ranks, and then ending with expected growth as a concept. So those are the 4 main areas we'll cover today. So as we go forward and think about metrics, really the metric has been determined to support different purposes, and there's a lot of different purposes. Many of them are related to one another, but there are also unique attributes of metrics, of particular metrics, that will help you better understand certain growth features, certain status features than others. So the next 3 slides, I just have quick examples of metrics in our lives. We all, probably most of us drive, we look at a dashboard every day of a million different metrics. Some of us don't care about most of those, others care about many of those, but those are all different metrics. Together, they're trying to give you an evaluation of your driving as well as an evaluation of how the car is performing. So that's one example. The next one, I don't know much about, but I'm trying to learn more about because my children are more involved, but with fantasy football, a million different metrics out there to guide your fantasy football picks as you monitor it through the season, who's doing what when. All of these are just different metrics. They relate to one another, but again, they're different and are bringing different pieces of information. And the third one, as I close in on retirement, is something I should be paying better attention to, but investments. Again, a whole different slate of metrics that are unique to what they're talking about, unique to watching growth, unique to watching change over time. Again, if you live in that world, having ingested and integrated those metrics into your day-to-day conversations is really what's important. So as we look forward to the next slide on assessment metrics, we treat them in the same way we treat, our watches that tell us how fast our hearts are racing and so forth. So all of those things, and here this slide just simply lists the 6 we're going to touch upon today, but they're related, but they're unique in their contributions to the conversation about student growth and student status with respect to achievement. So there's the title of all of them. We're going to go down and sort of go into each of these in greater detail here as we go through the next few slides.
And what we hope that this webinar will help you with is really demystifying some of these metrics and actually helping you identify which ones are most suited to the purposes for which you're using the Iowa assessments, as well as which ones are easiest for you to use to communicate to different kinds of audiences. Some metrics might be more appropriate for addressing in-service with teachers in a school building. Others might be better suited to understanding student achievement and growth to the general public at school board meetings, for example. Others are going to be useful for certain specific purposes, and to get beyond the sort of acronyms and understand some of the characteristics of these metrics is our principal goal today.
So the next slide is one of the handouts that Allison has posted for this webinar. So this list of student score reports, I just merely put this up there to show those 6 different metrics and where they appear in a score report like this, a list report such as this. You can see across the top, obviously, are the testing areas, but then for each student that has been tested, he or she has 6 different metrics that are reported here. And again, to Steve's point, making the most out of those 6 different touch points is what we hope to achieve today.
This particular example looks like a student score report that is available both as what we call one of the print classics as well as in Data Manager. The Data Manager interface allows you to select which of these metrics you want to include in a report. And that you might deliver to a particular audience, or that you might create and print out in Data Manager for certain purposes. So the fact that you have some selection capabilities within Data Manager is an important feature of that tool.
The next slide just sort of shows the hierarchy of these things. We go in and collect information from the individual student. That individual student answers questions, gives us their responses, and we call that observed score their raw score, what they actually sort of shared with us at the time of administration. Because there are multiple versions of the Iowa assessments, multiple versions of other types of assessments, the typical practice is to then take those raw scores and translate them to a standard score. And that standard score represents a scale that can be used interchangeably. So it does not matter if I took Form E or Form F or Form G of the Iowas, the standard score from all three of those forms is interpreted in the same way. Any slight variations in raw scores are adjusted through research to have integrity and confidence in that standard score.
The standard scores are also directly linked to a variety of other metrics that appeared on that list report. The most transparent one, I think, for users of the Iowa assessments is probably the National Percentile Rank. Other metrics of interest that are linked directly to standard scores would be what are listed below National Percentile Rank: Stanines, normal curve equivalence, and grade equivalence. And you may have heard these terms thrown around in reports of achievement, and these are some of the scores we're going to try to demystify a little bit. And a very important thing to understand, however, with respect to all of these metrics, is they're closely related. They are related to each other. It's just that they present information about achievement and growth in different frames of reference, in different ways that might be better suited to certain audiences, as we said before. The next slide shows the sort of the techie version of the metrics is in terms of how we think about them with respect to the statistical underpinnings of scores on the Iowa assessments. We're not going to talk about the curve as much as we're going to talk about how to use the numbers that are associated with scores. So this is just sort of a reference to illustrate the fact that all of the metrics can be seen as different versions of the same kind of information, but suited to particular purposes.
The next slide just helps us think about, okay, the conditions. What metric do I want? Because I want to match it to the interpretation. And so the two we're going to focus on today, the standard score and the National Percentile Rank, are particularly well suited for growth. Other things like the Stanine or the normal curve equivalency might be better for the selection, understanding who is in that top part of a distribution. Others might be more appropriate for identification for remediation, those that are in the lowest part of a distribution of students. So we want to consider the interpretation that's at hand and how best to match that. As Steve said, we also want to consider the audience. The audience, as Steve showed on the slide before, there's a lot of sort of connections between those distributions, but perhaps if your primary audience is your Board of Education, perhaps your primary audience is your parent that's talking to you in a parent-student conference, then a metric that they're more familiar with that brings greater meaning for them is a critical consideration in the selection of the metric. We also have to understand the attributes of the scale and understand, as on the Iowa assessments, there were those 6 different scores presented. How can I be an 89 in one and an 8 in something else? So understanding the ranges of those scales, where they sort of have the most information on that scale, those are what we would call the attributes of the scale. How many of them help to differentiate versus how many of those cluster students together.
If you're a building administrator, an important thing to understand with respect to attributes are what kinds of summary information are appropriate given a particular metric. So if you're interested in trying to understand what is the average performance of students in 3rd grade in your building, you would probably want to go to a standard score and make those kinds of summary calculations with standard scores, as opposed to doing them, for example, with percentile ranks. So some of those characteristics are important to understand about metrics.
And because there's a complement of scores provided, it's also fine to support multiple purposes locally. So if you're using an assessment like the IWAS for selection into gifted and talented, as well as monitoring growth, as well as understanding cohort evaluations across time, then particular metrics will help you, right? You might take the STAY9 for one, while you might take the standard score for something else. And that's perfectly acceptable. So as long as you're matching the particular purpose, and I would say the IWAS can support multiple purposes locally, and you can use that information to sort of assess a little less and get more information from a given time that you're testing, so that, again, sort of the value of the information matches more closely the decisions you're trying to make. Okay, so that's sort of a quick overview of metrics. Again, the two we're going to focus on next, standard score and national PR, we're going to go into a deeper dive. But the other relationships of all of these, the STAY9s and the national curve equivalency, if you're looking for additional information, please just let Allison know. She can let us know, because we're interested in helping to make these metrics as valuable to you as possible. Okay, so the next slide is just an introduction into that standard score. And again, growth being one of those primary uses. And before we jump into the use of the metric, I want to just be sure we all share the same list of assumptions around growth. The IWAs have been measuring growth for many, many decades. And I think it's built on 3 really underlying assumptions that you as classroom educators or you as administrators understand better than anyone, that students learn at very different rates. Students start at very different rates, they end at very different rates. Some go quickly upwards, some are more plateaued, but a good growth measure allows for those things. You can go in, match where you are with the child versus allowing the test to tell you the child's not even on that metric. The IWAs go the opposite way and give you good information regardless of where that student starts and regardless of where they go forward from that point. And it also allows some very specific goal setting. So those are our 3 assumptions around growth, and different assessments sort of take on different assumptions as they talk about their growth metrics. And I just wanted to be clear about ours. They're very, they're oriented towards action at the local level, interpretation and action.
An important attribute of the standard score is the fact that it's really on a scale, a numerical scale, that is somewhat arbitrarily determined. It's not going to associate a student's performance with grade level directly, for example. It's not going to associate students' performance with how they compare to other students in the classroom or other students in the nation. It is ideally suited for watching a student grow over time and to provide benchmarks for what kind of growth would be reasonable goals to establish for students. The next slide goes into some of these details with respect to what we call the achievement continuum, which is really a very broad range of points on a learning trajectory. Sometimes these are called learning progressions that span a very wide range. So the standard score scales for the Iowa assessments begin with scores around 80 for students who are in kindergarten, and they go all the way up to scores in the 300s for students who are in the high school grade. So it's a very broad kind of scale. And the goal of the Iowa assessments is to be able to provide reliable and valid information that helps locate where a student is on that learning continuum.
The next slide really goes in and helps to demonstrate one of the attributes of the standard score scale.
And you can see this plot is just a very simple illustration of how standard scores, we call them NSSs, I guess, on this slide, because they are determined from national studies of student achievement across the span of grade levels that is covered by the Iowa assessments. So standard scores march up across the grades. The average standard score in the spring of the year is plotted in this graph, and you can see how students in grade 4 are going to, on the average, have higher standard scores numerically than students in grade 3. Likewise, students in grade 5 higher than students in grade 4. So the numbers themselves are going to index the amount of growth that might be observed in students over time. That's the principal attribute of the standard score scale, which we have provided a very direct sort of conversion to what some people are familiar with in the grade equivalence scale on the next slide. Grade equivalence, national grade equivalents also march up with grade level, and they do provide a relatively convenient metric for certain purposes. So you can see the average grade equivalence score in grade 3 is about in the fall of the year is about 3.2. That is a typical student score in the second month of 3rd grade. Likewise, growth that would be expected to grade 4 is located at 4.2, 5.2, 6.2, and so on. The reason we de-emphasize grade equivalents is because they're often misinterpreted. So when a student in grade 5 in the fall of the year takes the Iowa assessments and receives a grade equivalent score of 7.2, we would suggest that is a very high score on a 5th grade test. It's not the case that the student is doing 7th grade work. The student took a 5th grade test and scored on that 5th grade test about the way a 7th grader would have scored if the 7th grader took the 5th grade test. But very often parents get that 7.2 and go home thinking, oh gosh, my child is ready for middle school, when that's not really the case. My own recent experience with this was my granddaughter, who was in 1st grade, learned that she was reading 5th grade material. In fact, she scored on a reading test like a 5th grader would have scored on a 1st grade reading test. But that sort of example illustrates why we would defer to the standard score for purposes of understanding growth over time.
So to go back to the standard score just a little, the next slide sort of shows us, okay, we know, again, tying it to the assumptions, and as Steve said, the GE, the grade equivalent scale, is a derivative of the standard score scale and useful in some circumstances. So they go hand in hand, but I think we want to focus the next few slides on the standard score in particular. So going back to our assumptions, we know also any one child doesn't just go up like that model shows. They're not just on a perfect trajectory up. The slope's not always just right. So not unlike this pathway on our campus here, there's a lot of zigging and zagging as a student goes through their education, their achievement continuum. So the next slide is just an example of 3 students. You'll notice they're not as steeply sloped as the graphic that was showed a minute ago. Here we have 4 touch points, 4 grades that are represented. Reading is the score here. And the 3 lines represent 3 different students. Well, you can see the student in the middle, the student represented by the green line that person's taking a very different path, right? They took a slight downward trend, and then they had a very productive 20 to 21 year, and then a little bit more of a plateau out from 21 to 22. Again, each of those is an interpretable interval. The attribute of the standard score allows me to compare the 194 to the 186, the 186 to the 200, 200 to the 205. Those are directly interpretable intervals, in this case, across years. That student's path, the student represented by the green line, is a different path than the student represented by the orangish line. The student that's on the highest performing of these three students. Again, sort of slowed in the 1920 year, but then really took off and gained 15 points, standard score points in the year between 20 and 21. And again, another 15 points in the years between 21 and 22. So significant growth between 20 and 22 for that student that's represented.
A couple of other points while we're looking at this graph that are useful and important to understand about standard scores. Standard scores are the metric that we've been using to try to track student performance before, during, and after the pandemic. So, and we could observe with this metric a decline in that, as you can see in that green line, a decline between fall of 19 and fall of 20, or between fall of 20 and fall of 21. So the standard score metric is useful for those kinds of purposes, for understanding locally what kind of learning loss might have occurred, what kind of learning recovery is happening post-pandemic. That's one useful characteristic of the standard score scale. The other one that I want to point out is that you see three students, as Kathy said, who are very different from each other, starting in the fall of 19 at very different points on the standard score scale. All of the students over the time presented here from 19 to 22 are growing at some rate. And the standard score is going to show growth for students regardless of where they are on at the starting point in a sequence of assessments.
So just to further tie that to our assumptions, as Steve said, those students, even though there's only 3 of them here, they started in very different places. That was our number one assumption. We have good measurement, whether you're at that lowest, the student represented by the purple line, or whether you're at the highest, we have good measurement. You can also look at those differences across the years, knowing they took different paths to get there. And even those that had a more of a plateau or a negative slope to their line, there's still measurement that's going on there that allows you to say something, for instance, about the student represented by the green line between 191 and 180. What happened? What was happening to that child? Were they in the home? Were they in a school that did indeed completely shut down during the pandemic? Understanding those, bringing collateral information to help interpret these things, and also to help set goals for the next year. If I was the teacher of the student in the lowest line, the 161, I would never set a goal of 230 3 years out for that student. That would be an extremely optimistic goal for that student to set. Rather, I might look at how the student is doing between 19 and 20 and follow that trajectory going forward, and maybe even adding a stretch goal to it to up that slope going forward, but never setting it so out of reach that it would not be obtainable.
This kind of information is available through Data Manager in the part of the reporting system that deals with longitudinal growth reports, just for those of you who are interested in where to find this information. And your Riverside consultants can also assist you in extracting this kind of information from your own database if you're a Data Manager user.
The next 3 slides are just sort of bad graphics. I apologize. I was trying to take the idea of a pathway and translate it to a graphic, and you can see where my limitations fall. So, but I have 3 of these that look very similar. I just want to use them as 3 different examples of administration styles using the standard score scale. So here's a student that starts in 3rd grade, tests that student in the fall. With the Iowa assessments, that student obtains a 157. Then that student the next fall of 4th grade, achieves a 176. So I can look at the difference between 157 and 176, look at that difference of 19, and I can interpret that. I can say, did this exceed the goal I had set for this young learner? Did that difference of 19 fall short of the goal I had set for this young learner, and so forth? And I can follow him or her all the way through 5th grade. So that's sort of a traditional once a year approach to the Iowa assessments that allows you to look at growth year over year. The next slide, same little learner. In this case, we're treating the Iowas as more of an interim assessment where it's being given multiple times within that year. The standard score scale still allows me to say, she started with 157. By mid-year, she earned 162. By spring, 168. I can then again interpret, it doesn't have to be a year over year comparison. It can be multiple data points within a year to be sure I'm watching and monitoring growth for this young learner during that time.
And this would be an example where a school might be using the survey version of the Iowa assessments and using one form in the fall, a parallel form in the mid-year, and a third parallel form in the spring. So this idea of having an assessment program that allows that kind of flexibility can be used for through course types of assessment programs, as well as the first one that Kathy illustrated, that is a once a year in the fall or once a year in the spring, for example.
And to Steve's point, again, one of the attributes of that standard score, even though those are 3 different forms of the Iowas that would produce 3 different raw scores on the Iowas, the translated standard score is directly comparable. So that 5-point difference of 157 to 162 is directly comparable regardless of what combination of forms you may have used. Okay, and then the third and last of these lovely graphics, multiple years. If you're in a district that's looking more, as you watch cohorts across years, as you think about evaluation as they go from one building to another, all kinds of different configurations. But again, you can use the standard score scale. You don't have to give it 3 times a year or every other year systematically. The robustness and the underlying achievement continuum allows you to go across years, across multiple years as well. And again, the 168 to the 201 here, what that growth indicates across 2 years, again, is directly interpretable using the standard score scale. Okay, last slide. 2 slides, I guess, on the standard score. We're going to compare this to the national percentile rank here in 1 minute. But just before we leave the standard score, I want to just indicate, as Steve said, the achievement, the underlying achievement continuum and the scale that is associated with that shows this onward, upward marching. The 2 graphs that Steve showed, how this goes up across time, is just illustrated here in values associated with the national percentile rank, for instance, of 50 or 75 here.
What's in this particular slide represents the median or the 50th percentile of student performance nationally in the fall of the school year, the date or a date around the middle of October. So all of these scores for each grade level represent the 50th percentile, but you can see how the 50th percentile in the standard score metric in grade 4 is a much higher number than the 50th percentile in grade 3. Likewise, as you go up the scale, those continue to march up this scale that is our metric for the underlying achievement continuum. And the same thing is observed in the column labeled 75th percentile.
So just to wrap this up on standard score, sort of the takeaways on the next slide, you use the standard score to establish goals for growth, for change. and then translate that growth into, okay, how am I going to break this down? Am I going to break it down into periods of time within a year, across years? What can I do instructionally to better understand the very actionable steps that I can put into place to ensure my students changing by 10 standard score points or 5 standard score points and so forth. So that's how we translate that into looking forward.
And another great attribute of the standard score scale, because its metric is arbitrary, a goal for a student who's in the lower part of the achievement continuum at a given grade level isn't being communicated to the student in terms of a percentile rank or a grade level type score of a grade equivalent, but just as a number that will show up on a future assessment and against which they can think about their own progress and growth.
Okay, thanks, Allison. The next one takes us into this third or fourth sort of sections today, how I can now think about growth with respect to the NPR. So the next slide just merely says that NPR gives me a point of reference. We all know that with respect to where we are relative to a group of students and when those norms were collected. But we want to, today's lens is really thinking about it as an attribute of a growth scale as well. The next slide says, depending on what school or district or diocese you're representing today, but if you're in a state and you are taking your Every Student Succeeds Act accountability measure, you know that your state may be classifying students into categories like proficient, advanced, and so forth. What we have found is, although that's wonderful for accountability purposes, it probably falls short with respect to setting goals other than getting over the next threshold, but more attainable goals. Because those interpretations, especially post-pandemic, have been very difficult for districts to really hold on to and interpret as more and more students fall into the lower categories. So what we're suggesting here is a scale like a national percentile rank allows you to have a constant, a fixed point of reference, unlike some states where those definitions might be shifting. And that national norm, again, sort of gives us that reference point for going back and understanding when we've gotten back to where we were before the pandemic and where we're moving beyond that.
Right. And just to reinforce Kathy's point here, the national norms associated with the Iowa assessments were developed before the pandemic. Having that kind of achievement as the frame of reference going forward is extremely important in order to understand how students have changed both during the pandemic and what kinds of learning recovery are being achieved. If we were to use norms that were developed, say in 2021, where we saw the most extreme effects of the pandemic, those norms would look we call them soft because we would be comparing students to a lower achieving norm group. So the fact that the national norms for the Iowas are pre-pandemic norms is a very critical aspect of interpretation with respect to learning recovery.
The next slide, again, sort of shows that how, again, the PR will remain flat here at the students at the 50th percentile across time if the student is growing like we would expect them to grow.
Yeah, remember how those standard scores marched up that metric at the 50th percentile. If we were to think about this particular student, the typical student in any grade level at the 50th percentile, and look at this in a naive way, we might think, oh, this student's not growing at all. In fact, the student's growing a great deal. The student's relative standing with respect to national norms hasn't changed at all, but the student is growing. The NPR doesn't directly show in the numbers the fact that this student is growing. It's another level of interpretation required in order to understand that someone maintaining their percentile rank across grades is really growing.
So the next slide just helps us better understand the point of reference. We can look at things within, or we can look at things across. And I think even the next slide, Allison, is a better graphic of that. Here we have data points on the Iowa assessment from 2017 to 2022. We have them, we can look across third graders. So the different third grade classes that were in sort of a person's classroom or within a school or within a diocese within each of those years. That is a relative comparison that I can make using the national percentile rank. Or I can take a given matched cohort of students who were third graders in 2017. I can compare them to 2018 as they move into fourth grade, as they move into fifth grade, as they move into sixth grade, and so on. And I can use their national percentile rank to better understand how that same group of students is doing across the various grades they're in. And the national percentile rank allows me to do that. It says my average third grader was at the 75th percentile in 2017. I'm hoping they, as fourth graders, remain at the 75th on average in fourth grade and fifth grade and so forth. And changes from that would be changes for concern. Positive changes obviously are good. Negative changes, like the next slide might represent, would be of concern to us. Okay, so those students that were right around that 75th, again, as cohorts, groups of students, very, very stable, 75, 76, 74 for the 3 years, the 3 falls before the pandemic. When we test again right after pandemic, their average percentile rank falls 55. Okay, so this again, I'm using national percentile ranks here to look at change, to look at, in this case, negative growth between 19 and 20, but then to see positive growth coming out of that from 2020 to 2023.
And what you'll get out of Data Manager with respect to these percentile ranks for a group is the percentile rank of the average standard score, so that we're not directly averaging the percentile ranks of individuals, but we're looking at how the percentile rank of the average student has changed over time.
And I think the next slide, Allison, just simply highlights that change, that significant change. Thank you. So just the next couple slides sort of wrap up our conversation. So this is another metric. It allows us to use norms because norms have remained constant. So the point of reference remains constant. This is particularly true when things are changing. So if a school has made significant changes long before the pandemic, then the national percentile rank is a good metric to use as a point of reference. And then they can serve as a benchmark going forward. When I think about the questions I can answer, the next slide sort of helps us. How can I use it? If I look at 2023, for instance, compared to previous years, looking at average PRs for my groups, or I can look at individual national percentile ranks for an individual learner. Are my changes in performance, whether they're positive or negative, are they consistent across reading and math for a child? If so, that's one message. If they're different, then that might be an indication that the student is struggling in one area as compared to the other.
What we've observed in our research, as well as research across the United States, using a variety of assessments, is that the declines related to the pandemic were more severe in mathematics than they were in reading. We're watching very carefully data from 2023 going forward to see how the learning recovery is happening in mathematics in particular.
And I think the last slide on this, Allison, just sort of summarizes again the takeaways. We are always about multiple sources of information and being sure everything you collect in the classroom, your other district level, your diocese level assessments are all used as complements. So this is another piece of information that in this time, it's very, I think, worthwhile to have as many complementary pieces of information as possible to add in decision making. Okay.
Just one more comment with respect to what we've said now about standard scores and percentile ranks is something that you'll need to evaluate going forward when you think about the audience to whom you're trying to communicate information. And it might be that some audiences will understand what we've said about change and growth in the percentile rank metric better than they would in the standard score metric. And that's just something that I think you're better judges of than we might be in terms of general advice. Think about the attributes of these two metrics with respect to your own audiences and what you're trying to communicate as you decide which one to rely on.
Okay, so our fourth of four sections, how to interpret and how do we put a little bit more around these interpretations using both the standard score and the national percentile rank. The next slide shows just an example of, again, that national percentile rank here is the metric of choice. In this case, I would have two classes. Along the x-axis is the administration per attendance in third grade. Along the y-axis is the administration in fourth grade. So it's sort of a classic once a year sort of administration. For students that fall at or above the diagonal line, those are the students that are maintaining their percentile rank. So anything that's above that diagonal line is showing improvement in their percentile rank in the second administration. So the first star in the lower quadrant to the left shows that the person had a 25 on a national percentile rank the first year and went up to a 37 on their national percentile rank in fourth grade. That was a positive change. That was significant positive change. The same is true for the second upper right star that's in black there. That student went from a 60 up to a 75 from that third grade to fourth grade for a national percentile rank. The student we're concerned about there is the student that in red that started with the 60th national percentile rank in third grade and ended at the 50th national percentile rank in fourth grade. They made a significant downward trend. So we showed graphs that were showing the upward trajectory. We showed graphs that were maintaining across time. This is just another way to think about your cohort. If you did a real simple matrix between the two, between 1 year and the next, you can easily identify students that were exceeding their growth expectation versus those were falling slightly short of their growth expectation.
Any student on the diagonal line in this kind of simple little graph that you could make of students in your classroom, any student that is on that diagonal line is growing much the way every student in that grade would be growing. So we would say that that student is changing as expected, or as our national data have told us students change from the first administration of the Iowa assessments to the second. When the student falls below, like the red star, that's when we start becoming concerned, because that student isn't maintaining their relative standing compared to students in the nation. The student has still grown between the first administration and the second administration, but not as much as we would have hoped for, and not as much as the typical amount of growth that we would observe for someone who started at an NPR of 60.
And just to provide some quick sort of takeaway tables, the next few slides sort of show that. So this slide shows that what you would expect, expected growth between fall and mid-year, or between mid-year and spring for the student in the middle of that distribution. What would you, if you're setting a goal for a student, what would you expect? You might expect them to change 5 points between fall and mid-year, between mid-year and spring. And those values change slightly for the different grades, but you can see there's sort of the expectation is about the same. If I were to put high school on here, you would see slightly smaller expectations across years. So that's reading. The next.
But this example does illustrate the flexibility of the Iowa assessments in terms of being able to use the Iowa assessments in a through course kind of assessment program, like we were saying before in one of the examples on the pathway, using the survey edition of the Iowa assessments, for example, to do more than one measurement during the course of the year. These kinds of tables can be created for any 2 or 3 times a year in an interim assessment program.
And as a complement to this slide, the next slide shows that, okay, what if I didn't just want to set sort of maintaining goals, but I wanted to exceed or show some stretch growth goals? Then I would be looking to move a child from the 50th percentile in the fall to maybe a 55th by the mid-year to maybe a 60th by spring. And you can see then the numbers, the scale score differences from a 157 to a 165, I need to grow 8 points in order to up myself to a 55th percentile, or another 8 points by spring to increase my status to a 60th percentile.
And those changes in the previous slide were 5 points to maintain the 50th percentile. So this is, as you said, Kathy, an example of using the standard score scale and the NPR together to create stretch goals for students.
In the next 2 slides, we won't belabor, but they're for mathematics as well. So we have, what if I'm maintaining at the 50th? And again, you can see those numbers. That's right where Allison is, the fall to mid-year. Those look very, very similar in mathematics as they did to reading. And as I go to stretch or set a goal for somebody, I want to move my child, my class, I want to move the average PR up, then the next slide shows what those numbers again increase to 7 and 8 per. And again, if you're a once a year, then you would be adding these numbers across the year and come up with your total year goal. So again, just an example of how to combine the 2 different metrics we've been talking about. Okay, I know we're running short on time. I wanted to just show, and then you can spend time looking at this. Allison was kind enough to, the next slide shows us a group profile report. And again, that is one of the handouts here today when we're thinking about monitoring growth and setting not only individual student goals, but group goals as well. I think the next slide, Allison, sort of shows this pulled out in a more readable fashion. Yeah, this example showing from kindergarten to 3rd grade, the same matched cohort, how the metric here that has been graphed is a grade equivalence metric. But right under that, you can see there's a national percentile rank graphic as well. And these are fairly small classes. We have 21 students here. And you can see how in written expression and vocabulary, this cohort of students has changed over those 4 administration dates. Now, what do I do with this? Well, the last few slides just are examples of what you can do with it. I can look historically, I can put it all in front of myself, my standard score and my national PR here, 4 grades, and I can look across years. In this case, you can see huge similarities pre-COVID. The 65 national PR for grade 3 across 2 years, 69-71, very, very consistent. So that consistency is an indication of how these grades are doing in this particular school. The next slide might show what happens that next year. I see a significant decrease in that, the COVID year, where that 65 became a 48 in the PR metric. It changed from a 183 to a 175 in that standard score metric. So again, 2 different things. You could be messaging those different things because now as we move to recover, we're 2 years out from this and we have more recovery ahead of us, the next slide shows us what I can do with that. How do I compare the next year or the next year following that? This slide in particular shows, again, those grades across time. Maybe the third graders were greatest affected by COVID and how your particular school was dealing with that versus other classes that were further along in their educational continuum when COVID hit.
So as in the previous slides we were talking about with respect to both standard scores and NPRs, if we go across in a horizontal line for any of these grades, we're comparing grade groups in the same school from year to year. If we go down the diagonal, what we hope to be looking at here are matched cohorts so that we're following the same students from 18 to 19 to 20 and looking at how those two metrics behave for the same set of students.
And I think we will end here because in July, I think we're coming back to talk a little bit more about longitudinal, and examples like these that we've sort of rushed through here at the end, and we apologize, are good sort of stepping off places for the July, and how I use longitudinal, like the slide Allison's showing right here, to help me better understand where these given cohorts of students are moving and what I can do about that. So Allison, you could go ahead just a couple of slides maybe. Sorry, and we will come back to these. Thank you. One more maybe. There we go. And so again, sort of just to summarize, how do I use growth and expected? I can use expected to help me set my goals. It's not just, I'm not just picking a number. I can better understand what expected means. And then again, as the session before, I can translate that into very specific things. And the last couple of slides are just, as we end here today, we think of assessments as tools. Obviously, you are the primary resources that are with the learners every day. We hope you think of the results as something that can fit into a far more sophisticated, complicated picture around children and children learning, but that adds it from an external point of view as a complement to other things. When you think about assessments, the last slide then is just, it's saying, be sure you select assessments that have measurement precision, whether it be the IWAS or another one. Be sure you really explore the precision, because just because a number can be produced, it doesn't mean it's a precise number. So be sure you have confidence in the number, and be sure you can explain the metrics. If you pick up and use that national percentile rank, understanding what that means and helping your parents and your families of your students better understand that is critical. And then knowing that growth is one really important aspect of a whole sort of cadre of things that you can use assessments for. Okay, that we will be quiet and turn back to Alice.
And Q&A, there is one question, Kathy, that I would like to ask. There is a, so a parent asked if a child went from a 97 NPR to a 94% NPR, they believed that the student didn't really grow that year, but that's really an inaccurate assumption, isn't it, on the parents? Would it be better for them to then direct that, for the teacher or the administrator to direct them to the standard score in a case like that, to show that there was actually growth? Or do you have another recommendation on what score would be better to show growth for that student?
What you just said connected the dots, especially a change from 97 to 92, which are two scores that are extremely high with respect to the grade of and nation. The standard score metric would definitely show that student grew from the first administration that led to the 97 to the second that led to the 92, and by a substantial amount in terms of the numbers on the standard score scale.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure we got the information correct. So thank you.
Hey, you made our day with that one.
Yeah, Rita, that's a perfect question that shows, so at that very, very high end, if your group is doing very, very well, then the standard score metric is a better metric. It's going to show that growth because you're so high, you're being compared to the same group over and over. You know, you're not going to change much, or you might slip a little, but the standard score is going to show that growth.
And parents often just think about NPRs. They're not always thinking about those standard scores. And it is really, like you said, about the different stakeholders and thinking about, you know, who you're needing to communicate that information to and explain it to. So thank you.
And we do have, I'm going to put it in the follow-up email to everybody, but we have a way to, a report that will show how to track individual growth. I know you all shared today a little bit about the group, you know, a way to track standard score and NPR growth over time as a group, but we can provide that individual student profile report guide as well. And then I wanted to share also, I know Dr. Dunbar mentioned about using Iowa Assessment Survey. Wanted to also add in the Iowa Assessment single subject can be used and administered throughout the year to kind of show that growth along the way as an interim or as a benchmark assessment as well. Anything else, Rita, or any other questions?
No, no other questions. Otherwise, it was well covered. So, so thank you.
Well, thank you everyone again for joining us today. We are about out of time, but please stay tuned for our webinar next week, where we are going to look at supporting students with measuring foundational skills in reading, identifying where students may have missed some instruction during the pandemic. So we are looking forward to another wonderful discussion then. And we would love definitely to hear what you all are doing in your schools and districts and dioceses to support student achievement as students learn to their fullest potential. So share with us your success stories, how you're looking at data reports, how you're using a lot of these assessment scores, and how you're helping students understand these scores. So tag us on social media and keep in touch. Is there anything else that you want to add, Dr. Welch, Dr. Dunbar, or Rita?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Allison.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. And thank everyone who joined us as well. We hope to see you again for another webinar. And until next time, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.